Judiciary Committee will come to order. We have 4 items on the agenda today. We'll be voting on the nominations of Lisa Monaco and Anita Gupta to serve as Deputy Attorney General and Associate Attorney General, respectively. We also have on the agenda 2 bipartisan intellectual property bills, the IDEA Act and the Arts Act. I might also say that if members have not heard, we have 4 votes on the floor scheduled in succession beginning at 10:45. So there is some pressure to, of course, answer those roll calls in a timely fashion and try to continue the business of this committee in the meantime. We will do our best. I've spoken at length about the need to restore the Justice Department's independence and integrity. As nominees for Senior Justice Department leadership, Ms. Monaco and Ms. Gupta will be charged with restoring the faith of the American public in the rule of law. Swiftly confirming these nominees is critical. We have many challenges facing America. To name one, last week, this country witnessed another horrific mass shooting in Atlanta. We do not yet have a clear picture of the shooter's motive, but we know that 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian American women. This massacre took place at a time when anti-AAPI hate crimes are spiking. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which the Trump administration unfortunately used to promote anti-Asian rhetoric, Asian Americans have reported nearly 3,800 hate-related incidents in all 50 states. Earlier this week, we saw the senseless killing of 10 people at a Boulder, Colorado supermarket. 10 lives cut short by gun violence that continues to plague our nation. 10 families that will be without loved ones at the dinner table. I don't know if any of you heard the interview on NPR of the daughter of one of the victims who was scheduled to have a baby soon. She was so happy that her father was alive to escort her down the aisle for her wedding last year. It was so touching. Of course, the loss of life of the policeman, Eric Talley, the first to respond on the scene. He was an extraordinary man who decided at age 40 to give up intellectual IT, I should say, technology, and go into the field of law enforcement. He leaves behind a wife and 7 children. These horrific attacks are a sober reminder that the public must have confidence in the Justice Department ability to combat the threats facing us. Based on these nominees' records, I have no doubt they are up to the task. They both have extensive experience addressing hate crimes as well as combating white supremacy and other domestic threats. Ms. Monaco has a long record of leadership on the government's response to national security risk, including domestic terror attacks and mass shooting. In her first weeks on the job as President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, she was tasked with coordinating the response to a terror attack in her own hometown at the Boston Marathon bombing. Such a role requires constant preparedness and deals with the highest of stakes. This experience on part of Ms. Monaco will serve the department well. As I have noted previously, she has the experience at nearly every level of the Department of Justice. This breadth of experience is rare and makes arguably Ms. Monaco the most qualified individual ever nominated to serve as Deputy Attorney General. She understands the inner workings of the department, well positioned to boost the morale of the professionals, and she will certainly hit the ground running on day one. Anita Gupta is an exceptionally well-qualified person to be Associate Attorney General. At the time of her hearing, she already had strong support of numerous conservatives, Grover Norquist, Michael Chertoff, Mark Holden. Others are publishing items in the conservative-leaning newspapers to say that they too believe she is the right person for the job. Since then, the list has grown. Larry Thompson, who served as Deputy Attorney General under President George W. Bush. Tom Coleman, Republican member of Congress for 16 years, representing Missouri. Trevor Potter, a Republican commissioner and chairman of the Federal Election Commission. All of them have endorsed Anita Gupta for this job in no uncertain terms. Her extensive support from prominent conservatives is not an aberration. It is the natural result of the fact that she has worked across the partisan divide throughout her entire career. And just reflect for a moment what a challenge that is in the controversial world of civil rights, and yet she came out with this dramatic commitment by conservatives to support her publicly. Unfortunately, too many Republicans in the Senate refuse to acknowledge that fact and continue, unfortunately, to spread baseless stories about her. And so I feel the need to briefly address several at this point. A number of my colleagues continue to falsely claim that Ms. Gupta supports defunding the police. Ms. Gupta has repeatedly made it clear this is not the case. I'm not going to read the quotes from the Executive Director of the Fraternal Order of Police, Jim Pasco, the President of the National Sheriff's Association, or the Federal Law Officer Association. I just wanted to ask you to think over this for a moment. If Ms. Gupta wanted to defund the police, would she have the support of the Fraternal Order of Police, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the National Sheriff's Association, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, and many other groups? Of course not. Some of my Republican friends have criticized Ms. Gupta for opposing a number of President Trump's judicial nominees while she led the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I'm sure the names Jeff Sessions and John Ashcroft ring a bell with the members of this committee. Both of those nominees became Attorney General despite having strongly opposed numerous judicial nominees. Now, some of my Republican colleagues have criticized Ms. Gupta for not sticking to her past position on drugs. Let's be clear, Ms. Gupta has never advocated that all drugs should be legal, as one of my colleagues on this committee incorrectly claimed in questions for the record. Ms. Gupta did write 9 years ago that she favored decriminalizing simple possession of small amounts of marijuana and other drugs. At our hearing, Ms. Gupta was completely forthright in explaining that she has changed her mind over the years on decriminalizing drug possession, due in part to her own family's experience with opioid addiction. If changing your mind on the legalization or criminalization of drugs disqualifies you for public office, I would remind my colleagues that over the last 10 years, there has been a dramatic shift in American public opinion and in the laws of our states when it comes to the issues of drugs. There currently are only 6 states that make marijuana illegal: Alabama, Idaho, Indiana, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Senator Sass's state of Nebraska. 35 states in the period of time when we are questioning whether Ms. Gupta may have changed her mind decided to make marijuana legal for medical purposes. 35 states. Other states reached out to decriminalize it, many of them, and even 11 made this recreational in nature, and my state is one of them. The point I'm trying to get to is to say Ms. Gupta may have changed her mind on drugs reflects what's happening in America. And to say that that disqualifies her for office may disqualify a lot of us who were part of that conversation. My Republican colleagues asked Ms. Gupta approximately 800 written questions for the record. 800. The last nominee for Associate Attorney General, Rachel Brand, who may have been from the state of Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, Rachel Brand, was asked 110 questions. 800 versus 110. I would note that 800 questions are substantially more than Democrats asked Amy Coney Barrett when she was up for a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. In responding to these many questions, Ms. Gupta went above and beyond what she was required to disclose. She provided details of the assets of 2 family trusts. She went the extra mile to prove that she was willing to make all of her financial holdings clear to everyone. What a contrast to a former president who never disclosed his income tax returns. She also disclosed information about donors to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and its 501c3 affiliate, the Leadership Conference Education Funds. My colleagues have supported numerous nominees who were not nearly so forthcoming. One final observation. I think I know what the problem is. A woman with this strong a resume who is being opposed by so many on the other side, I think she's touched a nerve by talking about voting rights, because I believe that's an issue that is timely, controversial, and maybe way too partisan. Ms. Gupta has spent a significant portion of her career advocating for the right to vote. There can be little doubt that many of the attacks leveled against her flow from that one simple truth. Far too many on the other side are set on curbing voting rights rather than protecting and strengthening them. We should make it easier for all Americans to vote. Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. Attorney General Garland has made it clear he needs a team at the Justice Department. He supports these nominees because they bring expertise and experience far different than his own. Lisa Monaco and Anita Gupta are both incredibly well qualified and ready to continue to serve our nation. We should give Attorney General Garland the team that he needs to enforce our nation's laws. Now I'd like to turn to Ranking Member Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gun violence, as evidenced by our hearing yesterday, is on our minds and the minds of people because of what happened in Atlanta and Boulder, but also because of the long history of those things happening from time to time throughout our country. We want to find solutions that will deliver results and reduce crime. I'm glad that we had that hearing to drill down on which laws are going to be most effective. What will not be effective is broad laws that do not target the most common ways that criminals get access to firearms. We need to put our focus where it will do the most good. Beginning in 2013, Senator Cruz and I introduced Protecting Communities and Preserving the Second Amendment Act to cover the wide varieties of issues we repeatedly saw holding us back from better combating gun violence. Yesterday, we were reminded again of the many fixes contained in that bill are still desperately needed. The Government Accountability Office publicly released a report showing that trafficking of U.S.-sourced firearms into Mexico is a national security threat as it facilitates the illegal drug trade and has been linked to organized crime. Our bill would fight that very threat, among so many others, by creating a new offense for firearm trafficking. Now is the time for this bill to pass. I thank my colleagues who have expressed interest in co-sponsoring, and I hope that we hear from more as well. We're here today, though not to discuss and vote on two. We're here today, though, to discuss and vote on two nominations and two bipartisan bills on the agenda. The first bill we have on the legislation, we have two bills. The IDEA legislation, the Arts Act, I support them both. Now to the nominees. Nominees for the number 2 and number 3 posts in the Justice Department. Lisa Monaco is the nominee to be Deputy Attorney General. This is a critically important role that helps keep our country safe. The person in that position, as he or she is known as DAG, supervises criminal prosecutions of the Justice Department, the law enforcement agencies in that department like DEA, FBI, ATF, and the Justice Department's counterterrorism and national security operations. Ms. Monaco has spent her career on national security and law enforcement, so she's a consummate professional. She's a Democrat, sure, but one who follows the rule of law and I think gets up every day thinking about how to keep America safer. I worry that Ms. Monaco is going to be under a lot of pressure from the White House, outside groups, Congress, and even career attorneys to try to politicize the department in response to domestic terrorism. I've asked her about it many times, and I take her word that when she told us, quote, unquote, the focus should be on conduct and not ideology. I expect to support Ms. Monaco. The second nominee, Ms. Gupta, is more controversial. She's been nominated to be Associate Attorney General. The number 3 spot, as we've said so many times, she will supervise the civil side of the department, the civil division, antitrust division, tax division, civil rights division, and a soon-to-be created environmental justice division, and maybe a lot of others she supervises as well. As I've said before, Ms. Gupta has worked with my staff in the past on criminal justice reform, couple years ago, Senator Durbin, Senator Lee, and I led the fight to pass the First Step Act. This was a very important bipartisan reform to our sentencing and incarceration system. Ms. Gupta was part of the coalition that worked hard on that. I appreciate that work and the fact that the criminal justice reform has long been a priority of hers. There's more, though, to Ms. Gupta's record than criminal justice reform. Senator Durbin has pointed out that she's head of major civil rights organization. Very true. In that position, though, she's been a strident proponent of many very liberal causes in testimony, in public letters, and social media. Ms. Gupta, like all other nominees, says she wants to keep the politics out of the Justice Department. That's a good goal, but it's hard to disentangle her legal career from her very progressive politics. She's tried to thread that needle, sometimes telling us that an offensive statement of hers or outlandish position she's supported was one where she was just representing her organizations. But she's also told us that we need to look at her whole career as a civil rights lawyer leading these organizations when evaluating her. Which is it then? Do we look at what she did and said, or don't we so look? A number of us have tried to get her to help think through this puzzle at her hearing and in written questions, but her answers just seem to confuse even more. Sometimes I have found something I've found troubling. Ms. Gupta's answers to the committee is inconsistent standard she applies to how nominees should be evaluated. In her previous job, Ms. Gupta led charge against President Trump's judicial nominees. When one of them said something or anything controversial, Ms. Gupta was there to say it was disqualifying. But when Ms. Gupta herself said something controversial, we're told it needed to be seen in context. Or if context is unavailable, that it's worthy of forgiveness. She has not accepted invitations to forgive Trump's judicial nominees. The most startling example of this is on the question of Brown versus Board of Education. In the spring of 2019, Ms. Gupta led the attack against almost every Trump nominee because they had refused to say whether or not Brown versus the Board of Education was correctly decided. It was correctly decided. That's my point of view and point of view of almost everybody today. And I don't think anyone seriously thought any of the prospective judges disagreed. Nominees would say that they'd follow Brown as settled law and binding precedent, like all Supreme Court precedent. But these nominees weren't comfortable, in the words of Justice Kagan, giving, quote unquote, a thumbs up or thumbs down on any given Supreme Court opinion. But they did this for Brown and for Roe and for Heller. You name it, they didn't want to grade the Supreme Court. At the same time, Ms. Gupta wouldn't have it. She sent a letter to the Senate explaining that anyone who didn't say that Brown was correctly decided failed to meet, quote unquote, the moral standard for a federal judgeship. That was a shocking accusation at that particular time. So in written questions, I asked her, as many of President Trump's nominees were asked, to answer yes or no, whether a series of cases was correctly decided, starting with Brown and going to Roe and going to Heller and others. Ms. Gupta's answer was, quote, if confirmed as a Justice Department official, I will seek to ensure that the department follows the Supreme Court precedent as the law of the land, end of quote. In other words, she wouldn't answer whether Brown was correctly decided. In fact, her answer was almost identical to many Trump nominees whose answers were evidence of a desire to overturn Brown and roll back, core civil rights protections, according to her, as well as many members on the Democratic side. It's hard to read this exchange and not conclude that Ms. Gupta didn't really mean it when she accused countless Trump nominees of being secret segregationists. It's hard to square Ms. Gupta's partisan progressive activism with her presentation as a pragmatic problem solver. That's why it's hard to figure out which views or activities she wants us to judge her by. It's also why she seems to want us to apply different standards to her than she applied to President Trump's nominees. I've tried to be fair to Ms. Gupta, but I've found her answers are too inconsistent or evasive to make any clear judgments. That's why I joined my Republican colleagues in sending a letter to Senator Durbin to give her an opportunity to come back before the committee. That letter cited Ms. Gupta's record, testimony, and analysis from the Washington Post, concluded that her testimony to the committee has not been forthright, citing again the standards she sought to apply to Trump nominees. It then called for another hearing to address these inconsistencies. I think it would help us all if Ms. Gupta came back and set the record straight on issues like defunding the police, qualified immunity, drug legalization, and capital punishment. Without that, I don't think I can support Ms. Gupta's nomination. Her public record is too extreme, and her testimony hasn't helped me contextualize it in any meaningful way. I appreciate the work that she has done on criminal justice reform, as I've said many times, but I don't think running civil enforcement for the United States is the right place for a partisan progressive activist. As a matter of process, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to inform you of two things. First, my colleagues would like a chance to speak before the committee on Ms. Gupta as the rules provide. However, Mr. Chairman, I speak for all of my colleagues when I say that we would be willing to vote now on Ms. Monaco's when a quorum's here, and that's the end of my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. And we did discuss this in advance, and I'd like to have the committee participate in the decision that's about to be made because it's going to affect all of us. 4 roll calls starting at 10:45. I assume some of them will be kept open some period of time. We have 2 nominees and 2 pieces of legislation before the committee today. I am not going to cut off any senator who wants to express themselves on either or any of those items, and I will stay here as long as necessary, including the rest of the afternoon if it takes that. But the question now is whether or not we want to move to a roll call, either yeas and nays or a recorded vote on either or both nominees before each side has an opportunity to make their remarks. If one senator objects, then we will proceed to the remarks in relation to the nominees and proceed from that point.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cornyn.
I have no objection to a voice vote on Ms. Monaco, but I would like to speak before there is a vote on Ms. Gupta.
All right. Is there any objection to a voice vote on Ms. Monaco? Hearing none, the question is on the, let me make sure I state this correctly. Forgive me if. Unfavorably reporting the nomination of Lisa O. Monaco to be Deputy Attorney General. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ayes do have it. The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Now we turn to the nomination of Anita Gupta to be Associate Attorney General. I will not ask for a roll call because I believe the Senator Texas is seeking recognition. We're going to go back and forth if there are members on the Democratic side wish to speak on behalf or Ms. Gupta as well. I'll recognize Senator Cornyn first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a 17-liter jug of acetic anhydride. It's manufactured by Aventor through its wholly owned subsidiary, J.T. Baker, in Mexico. This is an essential ingredient in producing heroin from poppies, from opium. In January of 2020, Bloomberg did an extensive investigation into the use of these precursors that are tightly controlled on an international basis to produce illicit drugs in Mexico. And particularly in this case, heroin. 92% of the heroin that is produced in Mexico comes to the United States. And over the last 10 years, more than 100,000 American citizens have died from heroin overdoses. This is an existential threat to our people and to our country. I would also point out that over the years, Congress has responded on a broad bipartisan basis to the opioid epidemic in this country. We passed a number of pieces of legislation which I have supported and I think have enjoyed broad bipartisan support. The way heroin figures into this picture is that prescription drugs or are classified as opioids, but so is heroin. And it's commonly known that when prescription drugs are not available, that heroin is a cheaper and more potent alternative for addicts. A single jug of acetic anhydride sells for $324. It's capable of producing 90,000 hits of heroin with a street value of $3.6 million. The reason why this is relevant to Ms. Gupta's nomination is she owns $14 million worth of Aventor stock. And it's a family business. Her father's the head of the corporation. But it's well known that Mexican authorities, as far back as 2010, have found jugs of acetic anhydride manufactured by Aventor at drug labs like this one depicted in Sinaloa, Mexico. It's commonly known among law enforcement officials that acetic anhydride, although it has some legitimate uses, is so dangerous that many countries simply ban the product entirely. You can't buy it in those countries. The International Narcotics Control Board, which is, as I understand, an arm of the United Nations, has been trying to regulate acetic anhydride's distribution because they know that it's essential to produce illicit drugs. Ms. Gupta was asked about her knowledge of the diversion of this precursor chemical manufactured by Aventor. And she said, well, I'm familiar with the allegations made against Aventor for selling this precursor drug in Mexico. Again, this chemical, is so tightly regulated here in the United States by the Drug Enforcement Administration. All sales are carefully identified and tracked to make sure it's not diverted for illegal drug manufacturing here. But Mexico has never, at least until 2018, taken any steps to regulate acetic anhydride. It can be bought online. It can be bought in a medical supply store. It is readily available. And it's conveniently packaged in this 17-liter jug that can be hidden in the trunk of a car. This is what the drug cartels have been using, at least since 2010, maybe earlier, to make the heroin that's taken more than 100,000 lives in the United States in the last 10 years. I agree with Ranking Member Grassley that Ms. Gupta has been misleading and deceptive in many of her answers to our questions on really important issues like qualified immunity, the death penalty, things like defund the police. But in the case of legalization of drugs, including drugs like heroin, she's frankly lied to each of you and the whole committee. Well, I asked her during her testimony, because I had read a piece that she had written in HuffPost in 2012, whether she supported the decriminalization of all drugs, not just marijuana. And she said, "No, Senator, I do not." That's a direct quote in answer to my questions. Senator Grassley asked follow-up questions for the record along those same lines. And she said, quote, "I have never advocated for decriminalization of all drugs, and I do not support the decriminalization of all drugs." Well, to me, the most important word in that quote is never. Because as you can see, it's simply a misrepresentation of what she said in 2012. It's not just about marijuana. She said all drugs, fentanyl, methamphetamine, heroin, prescription opioids, you name it. All drugs. And then she lied about it to you and me under oath. Ms. Gupta would not even concede that as a result of her ownership of about $14 million worth of shares in Aventor, when Senator Grassley asked whether she had personally profited from the sales of this precursor in Mexico, she would not even acknowledge that that would be possible. But of course, she has benefited from all of the sales, legitimate and illegitimate, by Aventor of the various products that they sell. In addition to lying to the committee under oath and her connection with this precursor chemical that's used for heroin production, we now have a nominee who's been nominated to the third highest office in the Department of Justice. As Senator Grassley pointed out, she will supervise the civil division of the Department of Justice. What has the Department of Justice done in response to the opioid epidemic over recent years? Well, it's sued a number of opioid manufacturers in this country for the mayhem, the death and destruction and misery that they've caused to the American people in each of our states and all across the country. I believe Ms. Gupta's deception, her lack of remorse, her dishonesty when it comes to answering straightforward questions of the committee disqualifies her for the office of Associate Attorney General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Serious charges, and they deserve to be answered. Ms. Gupta is a shareholder of Aventor. She has no role in their corporate decisions at all. Per her ethics agreement, she has already agreed to recuse herself from any matters related to Aventor. At her confirmation hearing, she informed the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, this committee, that she will divest all stock that she controls. In addition, with respect to the assets of the trust that she does not control, it is the intention of the trustee to divest the assets of the trust at the next open window period, which at this time is expected to begin on April 30th, 2021. I am not an expert on acetic anhydride, but I will tell you this. Due to the potential for misuse of acetic anhydride outside of the regulated supply chain, Aventor announced in September 2020 they are stopping all sales of the product in Mexico and have properly discarded all inventory of acetic anhydride in Mexico. Despite the statement made by the senator, according to Avantor, reported in Bloomberg, the company never sold acetic anhydride to any distributor or retailer who was not registered with Mexico's health regulator. I'm going to mispronounce the Spanish word. It looks like COFEPRIS, COFEPRIS. The company informed distributors and retailers in early September 2020. Bloomberg also reported that Avantor is not the target of any criminal probe. So, building a case that this woman is somehow responsible for a corporate decision that she is not part of, there's no basis for this, in fact. And I'm sorry that the senator has made that charge without any evidence to the contrary. And let me say a word about, we can go back and forth about what she may have said 8 or 9 years ago on decriminalization. I will just tell you that based on what I've heard from her, she was unequivocal in her statement that she was opposed to the decriminalization of all drugs because of a family experience which occurred, and she didn't go into detail, nor did we ask. The point I try to make in my opening statements is how many of us have been party to conversations over the last 10 years where questions were raised about decriminalization, legalization of drugs? Virtually all of us. And in the states we represent, with the exception of the state of Nebraska, Senator Sass represents, decisions have been made throughout that period of time as to changing the laws on decriminalization and legalization, whether it's medical marijuana in 35 states, whether it's legalization in another 11 states. Those things have been happening. To say that she should be held responsible because she may have changed a position on drugs over a period of 10 years, how many of us have not changed a position on any major issue, and certainly on this issue, which we continue to debate? I'm struggling to understand the fierce opposition of the Republicans to this nominee. She is extraordinary. She has a support of law enforcement groups any one of us would be proud to have, and yet she continues to be labeled as soft on crime or wanting to defund police, and there's no truth to that whatsoever. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with what you have said. You know, we hear these claims about people's, and they're always sort of like 3 points removed on their financial background and so forth. The financial statement the nominee has to file with us is a heck of a lot more extensive than senators ever have to file anywhere. And Ms. Gupta has filed it and makes it very clear, not by speculation, but just what her places are. And in fact, she is going to, I suspect, take a fairly significant financial hit in getting rid of some of these things just to take this position to serve the country. I unequivocally support Anita Gupta to be Associate Attorney General. There's been all kinds of fact-free attacks against her. She's called an anti-police crusader. Well, like some on this committee, I served in law enforcement for 8 years. I think she's one of the most pro-law enforcement nominees put forward by the administration to date. Look at the people that support her. They go across the political spectrum, including the Fraternal Order of Police. I know the people on these various law enforcement groups that are supporting her. These reflect the real solid feelings of law enforcement. They wouldn't be supporting her if they didn't feel that she was extremely well qualified. Again, I look at my own years in law enforcement. I would not support somebody who is going to work against the best in law enforcement. I feel she'll work for the best in law enforcement, and Mr. Chairman, I intend to vote for her.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. The question before the committee is whether or not we want to have the vote at this point on Ms. Gupta before the roll calls begin or to delay until afterwards. Is there an objection to having the roll call on Ms. Gupta?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be heard.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans expect independence and impartiality from the Justice Department's number 3 official. That leader should be tough on crime, tough on drug dealers, and not a partisan who embraces double standards. As the first female senator from Tennessee, I am a firm believer in helping women succeed. 2 years ago, I was delighted to shepherd a highly qualified judicial nominee through this committee. Naomi Rao is now Judge Rao on the D.C. Circuit. She's incredibly qualified. She clerked for Justice Thomas, was an OIRA administrator, and she served as a law professor. She also happened to be the first South Asian woman to serve on what many consider the second highest court in the country. It was a historic nomination worth celebrating, but Ms. Gupta still chose to oppose Judge Rao's nomination. Another federal judge, Judge Ada Brown of Texas, was the unfortunate target of Ms. Gupta's attacks. Judge Brown had served as a state judge for several years before being elevated to the federal bench, and she too was incredibly qualified. She broke barriers as the first black female judge to serve on the North District of Texas, but Ms. Gupta opposed her too, for wholly political reasons. On one hand, Ms. Gupta claims judicial diversity must be a big priority for future presidents. That's a direct quote. In reality, she only supports highly qualified federal judges who are women of color if they agree with her politics. In Tennessee, we are fighting an opioid epidemic. Opioid deaths hit over 1,300 in 2018 and continued to surge during the pandemic. The battle against opioids will only be won if federal law enforcement leads the charge in holding drug traffickers accountable for spreading fentanyl across our communities. Certainly, we need treatment and community support for addicts, but we also need to investigate and prosecute criminals and gang leaders. If and when they're found guilty, we need federal prosecutors who will recommend tough prison sentences and judges who will ensure the punishment fits the crime. The last thing Tennesseans need is a leader at DOJ advocating for legalization of marijuana and drug crimes. We've referenced the Huffington Post op-ed in 2012 where she writes, and I quote again, "States should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs," end quote. Well, if Ms. Gupta doesn't take a very large amount of fentanyl to kill someone, a 2 milligram dose of fentanyl is enough to kill most people, according to the DEA. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. The amount of fentanyl seized at our border by CBP has tripled. This has tripled in the last 4 months compared to the same time last year. Earlier this year, the Justice Department charged 2 drug traffickers for conspiring to traffic 2.5 tons of methamphetamine and 100,000 fentanyl pills into our country. Ms. Gupta can be soft on crime at the nonprofit she runs. She can't do that at the helm of the Justice Department. Our brave men and women in uniform deserve a leader at the Justice Department who will stand up for the rule of law, consistently stand up for the rule of law. Ms. Gupta won't even stand up for victims. She supported a controversial Obama-era settlement agreement practice that diverted payments to outside groups instead of victims. And we know she won't stand up for law enforcement. Under her watch, DOJ went after local police departments even when no criminal charges were issued for officer misconduct. While Ms. Gupta sat atop the Civil Rights Division, DOJ imposed draconian consent decrees that hamstrung the ability of local and state law enforcement to effectively serve and protect their communities. Today, we are confronting a record spike in murders and violent crime in big cities, and it's clear Ms. Gupta is not fit to lead the crackdown. Violent crime and murder are on the rise in states and cities that have defunded their police force and passed strict gun laws. By last December, Manhattan had 447 killings for a year, a 41% increase since 2019, and the largest number of killings since 2011. In 2020, LA surpassed 300 homicides in a single year. For the first time since 2009, we know from past experience that Ms. Gupta's policies tie the hands of the police from effectively catching criminals. Her policies will empower lawbreakers, drug dealers, murderers who deserve to sit on death row. Our streets will be overtaken by crime, our families and our children and neighborhoods less safe. As a mother and a grandmother, I believe that our communities deserve better. I will be opposing her nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question before the Judiciary Committee is whether we should vote on the nomination of Anita Gupta. Is there any objection? Hearing no objection. Senator objects?
Yes.
Senator Lee, do you wish to speak? Senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concerns with Anita Gupta are real, and they're based in fact, based on statements that she's made, and based on questions that we've asked and not always had answered. I come at this as someone who doesn't believe that Ms. Gupta is a bad person. I think she's been a very effective advocate for a number of issues. There have been occasions when I have agreed with her. She was an ally as we were pushing our criminal justice reform measure, the historic First Step Act that was passed into law a couple of years ago with bipartisan support. And so when she was nominated, she was someone who I really wanted to get to know and would have hoped to be able to support. But there are a few things that have come out in this process that have caused me great concern. Her lack of candor, her lack of willingness to engage in a meaningful dialogue on some very basic and I think legitimate questions are deeply concerning to me. For example, her answers to this committee on a wide range of topics, from legalizing narcotics, eliminating qualified immunity, defunding the police, and the death penalty, among many, many others, were at worst flatly inconsistent and at best confusing to the committee. And in many instances, it's difficult to discern what exactly her answers are to some of these questions, because in some cases she just didn't answer. Now, her failure, and in some cases her defiant refusal to answer legitimate questions on the record in this committee, it really is concerning. I think many of the answers that she did provide fail adequately and accurately to reflect her past involvement with sue and settle tactics, pattern and practice investigations, and with third-party slush funds, something that I'm very concerned about with regard to the Department of Justice. In addition, I've got some real concerns about Ms. Gupta's ability to separate herself from the activist positions that she's long advocated if confirmed as Associate Attorney General. Again, this doesn't mean she's a bad person or a bad lawyer, but she has been so long in the role of activist that, coupled with the way she answered, or in many cases didn't answer questions before this committee, These things tend to cast doubt on my confidence in her, and on her ability to carry out this job the way I think it needs to be done. I find especially concerning what I perceive to be a certain contempt for the views of people with whom she disagrees. Now, this contempt of which I speak is not something that showed up precipitously or in one single moment. These are things that we've seen over the course of many years that, when contrasted against her presentation and her testimony before this committee, do raise legitimate worries. For example, let's go back to 2018 when Ms. Gupta tweeted that Senator Susan Collins, our colleague from Maine, had failed her constituents based on her vote to confirm Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And her characterization that Senator Collins was, quote, sending a dangerous message to the survivors of sexual assault. In response to these and other concerning statements that she'd made and questions from members of this committee about those statements, Ms. Gupta acknowledged, as we all must, that sometimes people say things that they shouldn't say and later regret them. And she asked for forgiveness with regard to some of these intemperate statements. And I believe everyone's entitled to do that, and I think that is a legitimate request. But I think it's worth noting here that this was not a courtesy that she extended to others over the course of many years as she's challenged them. For example, when a nominee considered before this committee, Ryan Bounds, who had been nominated to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, to fill a vacancy that had been arisen in the state of Oregon. Ms. Gupta said the following of some comments that he had made many decades earlier while in college, quote, "While he has recently apologized for those comments, the timing of that apology suggests that it is one of convenience rather than remorse, offered in a last-ditch effort to salvage his nomination and win the support of his home state senators," close quote. When I asked her whether her request for forgiveness ought to be viewed against that backdrop, I sensed that she saw the connection. I sensed that she saw the relevance here. Didn't have an explanation for it, and I'm not sure that one exists. I, in some ways, don't fault her for that. From what I can sense, she's not inclined to provide grace or a second chance to things that other people with whom she disagrees, have written in college, and yet she comes before this committee requesting of us grace and a second chance for intemperate comments that she acknowledges that she should not have made, that she regrets having made. These statements from only a few years ago, or in some cases only a few months ago. I'm concerned also about Ms. Gupta's apparent contempt for Americans, including myself, who believe in the sanctity of unborn human life. Now, look, I understand that we in this room, just like Americans in general, have different positions on this. There are those in this room who take a different position than I do. I can freely acknowledge we can take different positions and still respect each other and each other's right to believe that way. She has disagreed in ways that are often very disagreeable and not at all respectful. Now, don't just take my word for it. Here's what Ms. Gupta said about Judge Sarah Pitlick. Quote, Sarah Pitlick is unqualified and unfit for a lifetime position on our federal courts. She has defended the most extreme anti-abortion laws our nation has seen to date, close quote. And this is what she said about Judge Lee Rudofsky. Quote, Rudofsky has challenged the constitutionality of reproductive rights under the 14th Amendment and has effectively asked the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade and Casey v. Planned Parenthood. Rudofsky is unfit and would bring a clear bias to the bench, close quote. So if one can't be pro-life, if one can't advance the position that unborn human life is worth protecting, it deserves to be protected under our laws. If one can't advance those positions because one doesn't agree with them, then in Ms. Gupta's view, perhaps that person is unfit for any other office. I can't imagine this is a statement that any of you would make. I certainly would hope not. I'm also concerned that Ms. Gupta may use the Department of Justice to deny biological females the opportunity to compete fairly, to engage in fair competition in school sports and in college sports, and might be inclined to deny parents the right to make decisions in the best interests of their children. I'm also concerned that she'll do all that she can to wield the Department of Justice against those who may hold different positions than she holds. And I'm concerned that she'll do so aggressively, that she'll conduct as many expensive, hostile, pattern and practice investigations against state and local law enforcement as she feasibly can, regardless of whether those might be warranted. Based on her past pattern and practice investigations, while she was serving as the Department of Justice's, as the Assistant Attorney General over the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, I worry that she'll subject state and local law enforcement to these same kinds of requirements and investigations.
Senator Lee, sorry to interrupt you. There is a roll call underway on the floor. Could you give us an indication of how much longer you'll be speaking?
Sure. I think I should wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you.
And I'm worried that she may well also rely on outside activist groups, some of the same groups for which she's lobbied, to formulate policy and practices for both the Department of Justice and state and local law enforcement agencies. I'm worried that she'll use the third-party settlement agreements to reward the activist groups for which she's lobbied at the expense of businesses and citizens and organizations that she doesn't agree with. And I'm concerned that she fails to respect adequately the freedom of religion and associated conscience rights, those that are at the core of our first freedoms protected in the First Amendment. In a 2017 blog post, Ms. Gupta advocated for forcing Colorado baker Jack Phillips to bake a cake, a custom cake, celebrating a same-sex wedding in violation of his own religious beliefs. Now, granted, Jack Phillips' beliefs are not my own. I wouldn't have taken that position. I'm not a good baker. If I were, I wouldn't have a problem baking a cake, custom or otherwise. for a same-sex wedding, but these were his beliefs. And here's what she said about Jack Phillips. Religious liberty is not a talisman that confers absolute immunity from any personal constraints at all. At times, the free exercise of religion yields to other foundational values, including freedom from harm and freedom from discrimination. Now, this, of course, doesn't reflect the language of the First Amendment. This doesn't, of course, reflect some 2.5 centuries of jurisprudence surrounding what it means to be a believer and the protections that attend religious belief in any form, including non-belief. And fortunately, 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices disagreed with Ms. Gupta in Masterpiece Bake Shop. Now, Ms. Gupta's supporters insist that she's a true consensus builder and one who works across the aisle. This is true when those on the other side of the aisle agree with her policy views. And I can attest, again, having worked with her on criminal justice reform, she's a great ally to have when one is on her side. And I would submit that the test of the consensus builder has to entail at some level respect for the views that differ from your own. And I think there are a lot of things that indicate that's not a skill, it's not a trait that she's exhibited. Before this very committee, on June 16th, 2020, only about 9 months ago, Ms. Gupta testified under oath that leaders must, quote, heed calls to decrease police budgets and the scope, role, and responsibility of police in our lives, close quote. When asked about her advocacy for defunding the police, Ms. Gupta said that she disagreed with that characterization as she was up for confirmation before this committee. Even the Washington Post, not exactly a conservative media outlet, got Ms. Gupta's flip-flop, correctly characterizing her June 16, 2020 testimony as, quote, exactly what defunding the police is all about. And now Gupta says she never supported the idea, close quote. Ms. Gupta's particularly divisive form of leadership is not what we need to unify our country. It's not what we need within the Department of Justice in a particularly prominent, important position as the number 3 person in charge. Therefore, I must oppose her nomination.
So the question is on the nomination of Anita Gupta. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The opinion of the chair. Roll call vote will be called. Clerk will call the roll.
You said you were going to hear everybody speak. You got 3 more people want to speak.
Let's take the vote, and then you can be heard all you wish. All right, the senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share the very serious concerns that have been raised in this committee about this nominee. This nominee, I believe, has a record that does not reflect a fair and impartial temperament, does not reflect a commitment to the even-handed administration of justice, but rather she has a record and a lifetime as an extreme partisan and as a zealot. And I do not believe that she has treated this committee with the candor that we should expect from all nominees. Just a couple days ago, every Republican senator on this committee sent a letter to the chairman asking the chairman to schedule a second hearing for this nominee. That's not a letter we send on many nominees. That is an unusual step, and every single Republican signed that letter. Why did we sign that letter? Because her statements before this committee were in direct contradiction to her long-standing record. And indeed, we urge the committee to follow the standard that Ms. Gupta urged concerning Republican nominees. In 2017, Ms. Gupta said, and I quote, "Chairman Grassley must put the politics aside and bring both nominees before the committee so they can be asked about their truthfulness under oath. Failure to do so would abdicate the independent role of the Senate. If the Senate Judiciary Committee is going to be taken seriously by this and future administrations, it must demand that nominees accurately respond to questions." That's what she insisted at the time. Now, when it is her answers that are not accurately responding to questions, that same standard is not supposed to apply to her. The letter that we sent the chairman outlined 4 different areas where her answers were materially misleading and dishonest. The first concerned her support for eliminating qualified immunity. During the hearing, Ms. Gupta was asked whether she supports eliminating the doctrine of qualified immunity. And she responded that she doesn't support elimination one way or another. Now, let me be clear. Whether or not qualified immunity should be eliminated is an issue on which reasonable minds can differ. There is debate on this committee and elsewhere about whether changes should be enacted in the doctrine of qualified immunity. My criticism with her on this is that she wasn't honest or candid with this committee when asked about this question. She told this committee she doesn't support elimination one way or the other, but in June 2020, and I would note this is not some ancient history, this is June of 2020, this is last year, she testified before the committee, quote, "Congress should end qualified immunity in Section 1983 claims." Now, when you have testified before this committee that Congress should end qualified immunity, you cannot credibly come before this community and say you don't have a position one way or the other. Those are in direct contradiction. Now, when she was pressed about her June 2020 testimony before the committee, Ms. Gupta claimed remarkably that her testimony was not her own opinion, that she was merely, quote, representing the consensus view of the Civil Rights Coalition at the Leadership Conference. Now, of course, she led the Leadership Conference, and she testified here, and in fact, during the June 2020 hearing, one of the other witnesses said that he believed qualified immunity should be eliminated, and Ms. Gupta added, quote, "I agree." Not the organization that has asked me to testify agrees, but I agree. That is directly contrary to her testimony to this committee. How about decriminalization? She was asked before this committee whether she advocates for decriminalization of all drugs. Ms. Gupta answered unequivocally, "No, Senator, I do not." And then she doubled down on that misleading statement. She doubled down in writing. When asked in writing about her position, here's what she said in writing to this committee. She said that she had, quote, "never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs." Now, there are some careful lawyers on this committee. There are lawyers who know how to speak precisely. If a nominee represents to this committee that they have never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs, one would expect it to be the case that they had never advocated. It's not, "I'm not currently advocating," not today, not this morning, not at this moment. Never means never. So was she telling the truth? Well, on September 4th, 2012, she authored an op-ed. I noted the chairman said earlier, gosh, on the question of drugs, some people have changed their minds. And, you know, some of us may have said some comment sometime in the past. Well, perhaps we're not discussing whether she sat around the breakfast table one morning chatting with her family and expressed a view. This is an op-ed by Anita Gupta. So she authored an op-ed. She sat down to write it. The title of the op-ed is, "It's Time to Discuss Criminal Justice Reform." The picture on the op-ed, I would note, is of a woman smoking a joint. This was not subtle. That's the picture of her op-ed. There's Anita Gupta, her name. Her op-ed is a woman smoking a joint in front of what appears to be a state capitol. I don't know where this photograph was taken. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that this op-ed be entered into the record.
Without objection.
In this op-ed, let's read what she said. She said, and I quote, "Decriminalize/defelonize drug possession. States should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs, particularly marijuana, and for small amounts of other drugs." Now, Mr. Chairman, as talented as the lawyers are on this committee, I challenge any Democratic senator to explain to me, under the most tortured interpretation of the language, how these two statements are remotely consistent. In writing in an op-ed that she signed under her name, she said, "States should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs." All. She uses the word all. That doesn't just mean marijuana. Reasonable people can disagree on the question of whether marijuana should be decriminalized or not. That's one reason why I believe that's an issue that should be left to the states, because different voters in different states can come to different determinations on that question. But she didn't say marijuana. She said states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs. All drugs includes heroin. All drugs includes cocaine. All drugs includes methamphetamines. All drugs includes fentanyl. We are in the midst of an opioid crisis in this country that has taken far too many lives, and the statement that states should, and it isn't considered. She didn't say states should debate, states should think about, states should study. It was states should decriminalize simple possession of all drugs. Now let's go back to what she told this committee in writing, where she said she had, quote, "never advocated for the decriminalization of all drugs." That is a flat-out falsehood, and there's no way to read the language otherwise. Third, her support for defunding the police. During the hearing, Ms. Gupta repeatedly stated she did not support defunding the police. The chairman spent quite a bit of time trying to rehabilitate the witness, trying to back her away from defunding the police. But those statements directly contradict her sworn testimony before this committee when, on June 16th, 2020, so not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, last year, under oath before this committee, where she said that leaders must, quote, "heed calls to decrease police budgets and the scope, role, and responsibility of police in our lives." That was her testimony last year. When she was pressed by a member of this committee that she had advocated for defunding the police, she said she disagreed with that characterization. But it's striking, just 2 days after her June 2020 testimony, she participated in a webinar in which Ms. Gupta said the following, quote, "Localities have been overspending on criminal justice system infrastructure and policing and divesting in housing, education, jobs, and health care. Some people call that defunding the police. Other people call it divest, invest." So Ms. Gupta understood fully well that what she was advocating for, in her own words, some people call that defunding the police. She wasn't confused about it. She knew what she was advocating for. And strikingly, and Senator Lee made this same point, the Washington Post, which reliably supports Democrats on just about everything. The Washington Post, her flip-flop, her contradiction on defunding the police was so stark that the Washington Post correctly noted that Ms. Gupta's June 2020 statement was, quote, exactly what defunding the police is all about. Now Gupta says she has never supported the idea. So the Washington Post, assessing it with their political bias in favor of this administration, even the Post was forced to admit her comments were directly contrary to her testimony. And by the way, her written testimony in June of 2020 before this committee, she said the following: Congress must also re-examine federal spending priorities and shrink the footprint of the police and criminal legal system in this country. This means shifting billions of federal taxpayer dollars away from criminalization, including policing, towards rebuilding communities of color.
Sorry to interrupt you, Senator. Can you tell us when you might conclude your remarks?
I'm probably going to continue another 5-10 minutes.
Thank you.
You know, numerous Democratic members of the Senate realized in the last election cycle that the angry rhetoric of the extreme left in their party was problematic politically, and that defunding the police, even if they supported it, was really dangerous politically, because most people understand that defunding the police is a spectacularly foolish option. And I would note that's not just the view of Republicans, that's the view of independents, that's the view of Democrats. And that's not just the view of Anglos, that is also the view of African Americans, and it's the view of Hispanics. And indeed, it is communities of color, when you defund the police, who are most often the victims of violent crime. Defunding the police is a radical position. And more than a few Senate Democrats have realized their party's embrace of that position was a political liability. So you've seen Senate Democrats backing away, saying, never mind, no, we don't support defunding the police anymore. Well, this committee is going to have an opportunity to go on record, because any senator who votes to confirm Anita Gupta is a senator who is voting in favor of defunding the police. This has been her long-standing position she has advocated for, so no senator should be surprised when your constituents say, why did you vote for someone who says, and again I'm going to quote, Congress must re-examine federal spending priorities and shrink the footprint of police. If you want to stop violent crime, shrinking the footprint of police is a very bad idea. And the criminal legal system in this country, that means shifting billions of federal taxpayer dollars away from criminalization, including policing. So every member of this committee should be on notice. You vote for this nominee, you are voting for shifting billions of dollars away from policing. That will hurt communities of color. That will hurt low-income communities. That will hurt victims that are plagued by gang violence, by drug dealers who rely on the police to protect themselves from homicide, from physical assault, from sexual assault. That is an extreme position, and her position before this committee was not honest and was not candid. The fourth ground on which every Republican senator asked for a second hearing was her position on the death penalty. And on the death penalty, she was asked about her long-standing opposition to the death penalty. And I would note, Ms. Gupta has not been nominated to be in charge of the Housing and Urban Development Department. She's been nominated to be the number 3 official at the U.S. Department of Justice. Whether or not she agrees with the death penalty is federal law passed by this Congress and in the United States Code. And having a senior official who has a passionate opposition to the death penalty raises serious question about whether the Department of Justice will fairly and impartially administer the laws. So how did she handle that before this committee? Well, when she was asked about it and her long-standing, passionate opposition to the death penalty, here's what she said. I also know how to enforce the law. And I did so when I was in the Justice Department before. When Dylan Roof committed the heinous act against 9 parishioners at the Charleston Church, and that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. So that's what she told the committee. And, I got to say, that's a comforting response. The shooter at the Mother Emanuel Church who committed a heinous, bigoted hate crime is a textbook example of someone who should be subject to the death penalty. And she brought it up, and she said, in effect to this committee, judge my ability to follow the law by how I handled the Dylan Roof case. That testimony on its face seems very good, except there's a problem. She wasn't being honest. She wasn't being straightforward with this committee. She was misleading, and she was misleading by omission. So what she said was, that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. Well, as Paul Harvey used to say, what's the rest of the story? The rest of the story, the Democratic members of this committee know well, is the Washington Post, again, the Washington Post in 2016, noted that Attorney General Loretta Lynch approved prosecutors seeking the death penalty for Dylan Roof, quote, over the objections of some advising her, including Anita Gupta. So when this committee asked her about it, she said, well, look at that case. That shows I could apply the death penalty. And what did she not mention? That she argued against the death penalty. She said, yes, he committed a racially bigoted, horrific mass gun shooting, but nonetheless, she advocated don't seek the death penalty because her own ideological views prevented her from enforcing the law and following federal law. And she knew that. And so before this committee, she didn't tell this committee that she had advocated against seeking the death penalty. She didn't admit that. Instead, she tried to claim credit. I want to go back to what she said here. And that prosecution and conviction happened under my watch. Without saying she opposed it, that is affirmatively misleading. And I would note also that when she was asked about these contradictions in written questions, Ms. Gupta found a brand new way of dodging the question. She said it, quote, would not be appropriate to discuss what she did at the Department of Justice. Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I want you to think about a nominee for the number 3 position at the Department of Justice saying it's not appropriate to talk about what she did the last time she was at the Department of Justice. I'm going to suggest to you it is entirely appropriate to talk about what she did last time at the Department of Justice, and the reason she doesn't want it to be appropriate is because she can't defend what she did at the Department of Justice and because she misled this committee about what she did at the Department of Justice. That is a lack of candor. I would note beyond that, part of the reason she thinks it's inappropriate to discuss her time at the Department of Justice is because her time at the Department of Justice was more that of a partisan zealot than of a fair-minded enforcer of the law. The state of Louisiana enacted a school choice program, a program to give hope to low-income kids, a program to give scholarships and opportunity to low-income kids, many of whom are African American, many of whom are Hispanic, who need hope and opportunity. I believe school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. Well, you know what? Ms. Gupta does not.
Senator, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but I just wanted to, do you have an indication as to when you might finish?
Probably another 5 minutes or so.
Another 5. Thank you.
Ms. Gupta does not. And we know that she does not because she was leading the Civil Rights Division. Now, the state of Louisiana is trying to give scholarships for low-income kids, many of whom are black, many of whom are Hispanic. You would think the Civil Rights Division would be cheering this. Yes, these kids need hope, options, a chance at a good education, a chance at the American dream. This is the mission of the Civil Rights Division. Well, not Ms. Gupta's partisan view. What happened? The Department of Justice intervenes not in support of the African American kids, not in support of education, not in support of civil rights. The Civil Rights Division intervened opposing the civil rights of those African American kids, arguing the school choice program must be struck down. And I will tell you, a circuit judge wrote that the Department of Justice had attempted to shoehorn, that was the word of the circuit judge, had attempted to shoehorn its regulation in an unrelated case. In other words, that this was a partisan political agenda, and she was willing to use the enforcement arm of the Department of Justice to target and go after and oppose the civil rights of young African American children in the state of Louisiana. That is not fair-minded, that is not impartial, that is a partisan zealot. When Senator Tim Scott introduced comprehensive policing reforms designed to protect civil rights, Ms. Gupta, who says she supports civil rights, one would expect would celebrate that effort. Instead, she denigrated Senator Scott as, quote, playing politics. Senator Scott is an African American senator representing the state of South Carolina. It's not the first time people on the hard ideological left have denigrated his service, have taken the view that a black man cannot have a view contrary to the hard left-wing orthodoxy. As an advocate, as a zealot, those views are ugly, but they're not out of step with partisan advocates. They are out of step with what we should expect at the U.S. Department of Justice. We should expect fairness. Two other points I want to make in conclusion. On the question of religious discrimination, Civil Rights Division, she was at previously, is charged with protecting civil rights. That includes the civil rights of people of faith. That includes the civil rights of people to live according to her faith. But her record doesn't demonstrate a commitment to protecting those civil rights. Instead, it demonstrates an animus to those civil rights. So when the Obama Justice Department was litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, Catholic nuns who've taken vows of poverty, who spend their time caring for the poor and the needy, Ms. Gupta was vocal in supporting that litigation, persecuting those nuns, attacking them for exercising their religious liberty. Finally, on the question of big tech censorship, one of the greatest threats to free speech in this country today, perhaps the greatest threat to free speech, is the growing power of the Silicon Valley oligarchs, of billionaires with monopoly control, brazenly censoring the speech of those with whom they disagree, silencing conservatives, silencing their political opponents, sometimes with the encouragement of members of the United States Senate, abusing that power to stifle free speech. Well, Ms. Gupta styles herself as a defender of civil rights, so I would assume she would be rising up for the civil rights of those who are being censored and silenced. But sadly, that assumption would not be correct. Indeed, Ms. Gupta in 2019, and we're not talking again 10, 20 years ago, we're talking 2019, Ms. Gupta lambasted Facebook for a new policy that exempted politicians' speech. She said simply allowing people to hear what elected officials say, that was enabling authoritarian politicians. Now, let's be clear what she's saying. She's saying, big tech, make sure the American people can't hear anyone on this side of the aisle. Make sure the only thing the American people can hear are the left-wing views she supports, and silence anyone else. She attended a dinner of 9 people with Mark Zuckerberg to discuss the matter. And she later wrote that, quote, Facebook fails to appreciate the harmful impact of disinformation on elections and the proliferation of hate speech and violence, particularly for communities of color. Now, the Department of Justice has ongoing litigation against big tech, monumentally important litigation. I'll tell you, as I go home to Texas and I hear from Texans, I hear concern over and over and over again, can you trust the Biden administration to go after big tech? Even though big tech are among the biggest donors to Democrats. They give millions and millions of dollars to the Biden campaign and to Senate Democrats. Can we trust them to be fair and apply the law concerning big tech? And I have to say, with Ms. Gupta's record, there's no reason to believe she could be fair or impartial. She has been a cheerleader for big tech. And to the extent she's criticized big tech, it has been, you're not censoring enough. Abuse your monopoly power even more and silence everyone who disagrees. That's dangerous. That does not give any members of the public confidence in the fairness or impartiality of the Department of Justice. You know, this committee heard Merrick Garland testify. And Merrick Garland testified that he'd be fair and impartial and apply the law. And many Republicans were initially encouraged by Judge Garland's nomination, because as a judge, he had built a record not as a partisan zealot. His answers to this committee were less than fully forthcoming, and I think undermined some of that reputation he had built over the decades. But I will tell you, the fact that a nominee for the number 3 position has this record as a partisan zealot raises serious questions about whether this Department of Justice will be able to fairly apply the law. Every Republican senator asked the chairman to hold a new hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that that letter be entered into the record as well.
Without objection, is the senator concluding?
I am concluding now. Every Republican senator asked for an additional hearing because of her outright falsehoods and contradictions before this committee. Unfortunately, the Democratic chairman declined that request and instead wants to try to force this nomination through. I think that's a mistake. This might well head through to a party line vote, but I think we should expect something significantly more of senior leadership at the U.S. Department of Justice.
So the question is on the nomination of Anita Gupta. All those in favor say aye.
Object.
Someone seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just take a moment or two to express my own deep reservations about this nomination, and let me just pick up where Senator Cruz just left off, which is with the most powerful corporations in the history of the world. We're talking about Google, we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about Facebook, the big tech corporations, modern-day robber barons, modern-day oligarchs who have exercised a degree of control over this government unprecedented in the history of our country. You have to go back at least a century to find companies that had the power and sway that these tech companies have, and even then it wouldn't be close. It wouldn't even be close. I mean, you look at the railroads of the late 19th century, but did they have control over news? Did they have control over information? Did they have control over personal data? Did they have control over what is the public discourse in an election? Were they able to influence a government? Were they able to decide who gets prosecuted and who doesn't for antitrust violations? And that's the power that these modern tech companies have, that these modern oligarchs have. And unfortunately, Ms. Gupta, she's deeply entwined with them. The leadership conference of which she has been the CEO from 2017 through 2020 received millions of dollars in contributions. Millions of dollars in contributions from these big tech companies. Take Google, $150,000 in 2017 to the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Microsoft, $750,000 to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, human rights rather, but that was just getting warmed up. Between 2017 and 2020, Google donated $3,051,500 to the Leadership Conference. Microsoft donated an additional $126,396.45 to the Leadership Conference. This is millions of dollars collectively, millions of dollars from the most powerful corporations, corporations that are seeking to and indeed are exercising oligarchic influence over this government. Corporations, by the way, in the case of Google, that we have learned just in the last week, successfully defeated antitrust prosecution by the Federal Trade Commission during the Obama administration. Newly released memoranda, which I have been demanding to be released publicly since I came to the Senate, finally found their way into the public domain just this last week. And what did we learn from the FTC memoranda? We learned that the FTC staff wanted to bring and indeed recommended antitrust prosecutions of Google in 2012. 2012. Was that suit ever filed? No, it was not filed. Why wasn't it filed? Easy. Follow the money. Because the largest corporate contributor to the Barack Obama reelection campaign was, you guessed it, Google. So what did Google do when the FTC wanted to file an antitrust suit? What do? They went straight to the top. They went straight to the Obama White House. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean it physically. They went to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and sat down in the White House and said, can't we reach a deal? Now, this was tried before in American history, I might point out. You know, when Theodore Roosevelt filed suit against the Northern Securities Company, one of the great trusts of the era, in 1902, J.P. Morgan went to the White House. And he said to Theodore Roosevelt, if we've done something wrong, send your man to my man, and we'll fix it up. And Theodore Roosevelt said, that cannot be done. And they filed the suit, and they prosecuted the suit, and they won it. When Google went to the Obama White House and said, send your person to my person, we'll fix it up, Barack Obama said, sure thing.
Senator, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you give us an indication of how long you will be
Probably
speaking?
5 minutes.
5 minutes?
And that's exactly what the Obama administration did. They killed the FTC suit. The antitrust prosecution never went forward. That was 2012. What has happened in the year since? Google has amassed even more power, even more sway, gobbling up competitors, shutting down those new market entrants, stealing personal data, the private property of American citizens, influencing elections, suppressing speech that they don't like. And if they have their way, it'll be just the beginning. What was Anita Gupta doing during this period? Soliciting millions of dollars in contributions from this same company at the leadership conference of which she is the CEO. Now she's being nominated to the United States Department of Justice, the number 3 position. She will be charged with investigating, potentially prosecuting, overseeing these same companies. Does anybody think that she will actually be able to do so without a severe conflict of interest? Does anybody who cares about monopoly in this era, does anybody who cares about free and fair competition, does anybody who cares about data security and privacy, does anybody who cares about free speech honestly think that she will be able to prosecute these cases, that she will be an independent prosecutor, that she will be able to act with independence in whatever capacity she is charged with at the Department of Justice on this critical challenge of this time? And I might just point out, it is no happenstance that big tech are among the biggest contributors, were among the biggest contributors to the Biden-Harris campaign. Do you see the pattern here? Big tech knows how to purchase influence. They did it with tremendous effect in the Obama White House. Now they're doing it with tremendous effect in the Biden White House. And nobody seems to care. At least nobody on that side of the aisle. For this reason alone, Ms. Gupta's nomination should be defeated. But let's talk about her record on the decriminalization of drugs. Now, this is an issue that is personal to me and to my state because Missouri has suffered terribly from the epidemic of opioid abuse, the epidemic of heroin abuse, fentanyl abuse. It has devastated the state of Missouri. As Attorney General in that state, I filed one of the first lawsuits in the nation against Big Pharma for their role in promoting and profiting from the opioid epidemic. And they did promote it, and you better believe they profited from it. Big time. Big time. For those who advocate for decriminalization of all drugs, which is what she had, make no mistake, it's what she has advocated for over and over and over. She told this committee that she doesn't support, she told me in response to my question, she doesn't support the decriminalization of drugs, but she has said, as Senator Cruz and others have established, as the record makes clear, she has openly and firmly advocated total decriminalization repeatedly. Indeed, I believe she's advocated it to this committee repeatedly. So what's the record on decriminalization? Because that's basically what we've tried with the opioid epidemic. You're supposed to have to get a prescription for those drugs. They are governed by the Controlled Substances Act, opioids. But what we saw for years, thanks to Big Pharma and their lies to doctors, what we saw was basically decriminalization. Anybody, prescribe the drugs, doesn't matter what, doesn't matter who, just push them out there. We know that these companies had strategies. They worked with consulting firms to figure out, in the midst of the epidemic, how they could push even more drugs onto the streets, even more drugs out through doctors. So if you want to run an experiment in decriminalization, just look at what happened with the opioid epidemic and look at the results of it. Total and utter devastation, and not just in money, although it certainly has impacted the bottom lines of many states, but that's the least of it. I have sat with families who have lost children. I'll never forget a mother who I met in Missouri who one morning went to wake up her daughter, her teenage daughter, to make sure she wasn't late for volleyball practice and found her dead in her bed from an overdose of opioids. She didn't even know she had an addiction. That same story is repeated over and over and over and over in my state and across the country. And yet we have people like Ms. Gupta who continue to advocate the total decriminalization of all drugs with no apparent understanding or response to the very real human costs. This isn't a policy, this isn't a think tank. This isn't just a policy brainstorming session. These are real costs with real people. And yet she continues to advocate, and in this case even worse, misrepresent her views to this committee about the decriminalization of drugs. Now, again, this is not a private citizen. This is someone who has been nominated.
Senator, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. Your 5 minutes is concluded. Will you be finishing?
Just 2 or 3 more minutes, Mr. Chairman.
2 minutes? Thank you.
This is someone who has been nominated for the number 3 position at the United States Department of Justice, who is in charge of enforcing our laws, who is in charge of going after those pharma companies, who is in charge of actually protecting the most vulnerable among us. And you have to ask yourself, for someone who advocates these policies that have harmed the most vulnerable, that have harmed the weakest, that have resulted in such monumental human tragedy, is this the right person to be leading the Department of Justice? I submit to you that the answer is no. And then we have her record on law enforcement. You know, Ms. Gupta has told this committee in the past that we should heed calls to decrease police budgets. She has been an advocate of the defund the police movement. Now, you look at just the last year, let's just take the last year. In the last year in this country, police officers, just in connection with the rioting around this country in the last year, I think it's something like 700 police officers have been assaulted. Dozens have lost their lives. In my home state of Missouri, assaults on police officers are at record highs. Shootings, homicides of police officers at record highs. And yet, the response to this is that we should defund them? Is that we should leave them out there alone? I mean, it's exactly, I submit to you, Mr. Chairman, exactly the wrong approach. We ought to be giving every cop in America a pay raise. We ought to be putting more cops on the street. We ought to be helping local police departments hire more. But Ms. Gupta wants to do just the opposite. She wants to let our brave men and women in blue stand out alone without the resources, without the support that they need, that they deserve, that frankly, that they have earned. And this might be one thing if she were merely a private citizen, but she is being nominated to help lead the United States Department of Justice. This is another reason I submit to you that she is totally inappropriate for that role. Her record makes her inappropriate for this role. Her record of failing to support law enforcement, of being willing to leave them stranded, as it were, in this time of crisis and in their hour of need. So for these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I'll be opposing her nomination.
Thank you very much. Is there any other senator who is going to seek recognition? The chair announces that after Senator Cotton has spoken, there will be a roll call vote on Anita Gupta, and if you ask for the ayes and nays, it will be taken. Senator Cotton is recognized. Senator, can you tell us how long you'd like to speak?
Oh, 10 or 15 minutes, perhaps.
15. We'll run a clock on that. 15 minutes. Thank you.
Colleagues, the simple truth here is that Anita Gupta is not fit to serve in the Department of Justice. We've heard a lot about that today already, but unfortunately there's a lot more to say. During this committee's hearing with Ms. Gupta a few weeks ago, I asked her, as several of us did, about her past statements. There are many, and unfortunately they're not just hyper-partisan, but also laughable and offensive. For example, I asked Ms. Gupta during her hearing about statements she made before this committee just last June, less than a year ago, where she said that she believes all Americans, every last one, are racists. Now, I know that Ms. Gupta and her allies have tried to spin those statements now that she's up for Senate confirmation and she needs to look more reasonable. But what she said was clear. When Senator Cornyn asked her in June 2020, "Do you believe all Americans are racist?" Senator Cornyn probably recalls that her exact words were unequivocal. "Yes, I think we all have implicit biases and racial biases. Yes, I do." That's not some reference to historical difficulties. That's not something in the abstract. That's not an academic theory. She is saying specifically that she thinks every American harbors racial bias. She didn't just say that it was some kind of implicit bias. She went out of her way to add racial bias. So I asked her about these statements. If all Americans are harboring racial bias, then against which groups does she harbor racial bias? At first, she tried to say that she was simply referring only to implicit bias. So I read her quote to her again, since she has a history of forgetting what she said, even when it's presented directly to her, on poster boards like Senator Cornyn had earlier today. When she was confronted with her words, she admitted that she holds stereotypes that she has to manage. She said that she is a, quote, product of her culture. She even said that she believes that all of us are able to manage those biases, but, quote, only if we can acknowledge our own. That she refused to actually acknowledge any of those biases and stereotypes. I followed up with written questions to Mrs. Gupta, hoping that she would maybe give a more forthcoming answer. Of course she didn't. Instead, she gave a general answer about implicit bias, saying that implicit bias does not mean we are harboring any racism at all. Of course, that is not what she said just months ago in June 2020 when she said every American harbors racial bias. Now, the truth, of course, is I doubt Mrs. Gupta harbors racial bias. But I'm also deeply offended that she would casually accuse every American of harboring racial bias. She's the one that invited the question, though. She's the one that said every American harbors racial bias, without evidence, without facts, just making grand, sweeping allegations against her fellow Americans and against our country. And Mrs. Gupta is not up for tenure at some left-wing obscure college. She's not going to be the editor of a left-wing journal that no one reads. She is nominated to be the number 3 official in the Department of Justice, in charge of the Civil Rights Division. Unfortunately, this is not a recent phenomenon for Mrs. Gupta, though. The idea that all Americans are racist, that we're really nothing more or less than the color of our skin, goes back pretty far for her. In 2005, she published a law review article on what she called critical race lawyering. In that article, she claimed that phrases like equal justice for all are nothing more than code words for some kind of twisted racism. Think about that. Equal justice for all are nothing more than code words for some kind of twisted racism. I asked in her written questions about that 2005 article and what she meant by it. Specifically, I asked her what she thinks equal justice for all is code for. She wouldn't answer that question either. Instead, she just said that diversity is one of our great strengths and that she's confirmed she'll work to ensure equal justice under the law. But in that same article, she brought up other of similar phrases that most Americans cherish and uphold, like equal protection or the rule of law, both of which she claimed again were code for something insidious. When asked her what she meant by these statements, again, she refused to answer. She again gave only a vague and general answer, saying she was committed to the rule of law and to seeking equal justice under the law. But, whether she believes these farcical ideas propagated by so-called critical race theory, that all Americans are racist, that our nation is racist, that our founding documents like the Constitution and the Declaration are racist, or whether she's just using them to advance her own ambitions and subscribing to them because they are faddish and fashionable on the left, it's really beside the point. Americans deserve a Department of Justice that is led by someone who actually believes in principles like equal justice and equal protection of the law and rule of the laws, not someone who makes these wild, unhinged allegations that every American harbors racial bias. Now that brings me to a second point, that's just one example of her wild, unhinged, intemperate statements over the year. For the past 4 years, she's made it her career. She has dined out by spending days attacking the character and the integrity of federal judges, judicial nominees, United States senators, some of whom are sitting in this room today. She wasn't just highlighting policy differences. It's fine to highlight policy differences. We have differences not just across party lines, but within party lines. Senator Cornyn is staring at me. He can probably think of all the differences he has with me right now. That's fine. Her statements were consistently ad hominem, baseless, personal, vicious. On October 25th of last year, she stated that voting for Justice Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation was, quote, a vote against civil and human rights. I asked her about that statement. Specifically, I asked her whether she actually believes that Justice Barrett opposes human and civil rights. Now, I think that should be pretty easy to answer. Justice Barrett actually has a long record of upholding our civil rights laws. Instead, she would only say that she has tremendous respect for judges, tremendous respect for the Supreme Court, not evidenced by this long history of statements. On September 27, 2019, she stated that Brett Kavanaugh lied today, showed himself to be a partisan, to be a belligerent, unbefitting of a Supreme Court justice. I asked her about that statement as well, and specifically whether she believes that Justice Kavanaugh is a, quote, liar. And again, she didn't answer, other than to cite her tremendous respect for the Supreme Court justices, that she's called a liar. In a telephone call with the media on July 11, 2018, she said Justice Gorsuch was dangerous and consequential. I asked her about that and whether she believes Justice Gorsuch is dangerous. He didn't seem very dangerous to me at his hearing. He seemed like a man who had been wronged by many members of this committee and who was standing up for his reputation and his character. Yet again, she only stated that she has tremendous respect for the man that she called dangerous. It's not just nominees. She got in on the act on October 23, 2018 as well, when she accused Justice Clarence Thomas of having an extreme judicial philosophy. I asked her whether she believed that Justice Thomas is an extremist, but yet again, she has tremendous respect for this extremist justice. On March 12, 2019, she attacked Naomi Rao, a circuit judge in Washington, D.C. She said, "Make no mistake, a vote for Naomi Rao is a vote against," yes, you guessed it, civil and human rights.
Senator Cotton, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've been notified there's going to be the 2-hour rule invoked, and we have 4 minutes left before that happens. And I'm afraid we have no choice but to call the roll. I'll stay here afterwards to hear the completion of your remarks. The clerk, on the nomination of Anita Gupta,
I'm not yet done with my
clerk will
remarks,
call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
Aye.
Call the roll, please.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Vote.
Ms. Klobuchar. Aye.
Mr. Chairman, as a point of order, does this comply with Rule 4 of the Senate Judiciary Committee rules? It does not.
Why don't we all get up? Why don't we?
Mr. Rosenthal.
Aye.
Ms. Hirono.
Aye.
Mr. Booker.
Aye.
Mr. Padilla.
Aye.
Mr. Rosso. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, this is the first time I've seen the Judiciary Committee not follow its own rules. This is an embarrassment and a disgrace.
Please, the roll call can't be interrupted.
Vote no. Yeah, it's really funny, isn't it?
Mr. Lee.
Committee Rule 4 states the chair shall entertain a
We're on a roll
non-debatable
call,
motion.
Senator.
This is out of order. I vote no.
Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Cotton.
I vote no, and I object to the chairman cutting off my remarks. I guess he found them too persuasive and thought that he had to end the hearing lest I persuade one of my Democratic colleagues. But I assure the chairman that what comes around...
We're on a roll call vote. The next senator's name, please.
Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Tillis.
Mr. Chair, I'd
We're on a
like
roll
to-
call vote, Senator.
Mr. Tillis.
Chairman, breaking the rules of the committee, Senator Tillis.
Mr. Tillis.
No. I believe the vote's out of order, Mr. Chair, based on the agreement prior to calling the vote.
Mrs. Black.
And the committee rules.
No by proxy.
Mr. Chair.
Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 11, the nays are 11.
The Senate has recorded a tie vote on Anita Gupta's nomination to be Associate Attorney General pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I will transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of this tie vote. Under Section 3, subsection 1B of that resolution, either the majority or minority leader may then make a motion to discharge the motion. The committee has on the agenda 2 bipartisan intellectual property bills, but I'm afraid our time has expired. We'll have to take those up another day.
Mr. Chairman, why did our time expire?
Judiciary Committee stands adjourned.